Testing. Test the YouTube sound. Testing. Test YouTube. Hello, hi Julian. How are you doing today?
Good.
Good.
How's the conference going?
It's going very well so far. I think we've gotten all of our tech things, we've got most of our tech things worked out. And so I think we're in good shape. I just wanted to confirm, do you pronounce your last name Agyeman? Is that right? Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. Hold on. Let's see. Hold on. I can't hear him now.
Do you want to hear him in the room right now?
I just want to hear him just on the computer so that we can just for me. Sorry, we're getting one tech thing worked out real quick. Okay, I can hear you now. Did I pronounce your name correctly, Agyeman?
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, terrific. So in about 5 minutes, I'll go out and kind of welcome everybody into the auditorium, and then I'll just remind everybody quickly of the schedule for today and the procedures for our Q&A session, since we have some people.
Shall we chat for my slides before that?
Sure, yeah.
Let's do that, yeah. So you need to give me sharing privileges.
Here, let me stop sharing myself. I think that I turned that on. Yes, you should be able to share your screen. Yeah, let's that looks good. I'm just gonna see what it looks like up here. Oh, perfect. Okay, that looks great. I'm just gonna move where this is here. Okay, perfect. Yeah, that looks great.
Great, okay. So we have an hour and 15 minutes, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So if I speak for minutes or something,
Yeah, I think that'll work well, and then we'll have some time for question and answer at the end.
yeah, okay. And you're in person, I mean, you're an people are in an excuse me, you're in an auditorium and so I'm going to be speaking to a crowd in an auditorium.
Yeah, we'll have a mix. So we have some people that'll be on Zoom with us, and we'll have some people who are in the auditorium here, and then we'll also have some people who will be watching our YouTube stream.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So do you need the podium mic for this section?
I guess not. You don't really need a podium mic for
Because
this.
you're just gonna introduce something.
I'm just gonna, I'll just introduce, and then that'll be everything on the podium mic. We'll have another person after.
So, Jasmine, do you want me to leave my slide up, or would you rather have your slide first?
You know, we'll leave your slide up. I think that'll be easier than switching back and forth between sharing. This is good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then right now I have you in the top right corner of the screen. Would it be better if I move the little video of you to a different corner if it's going to cover up any text or anything that people need to see?
No, that's fine. Is usually what happens is, your technician should be able to get it so that I am on the right-hand side and the presentation is completely freely visible.
There we go. I did it.
Yeah, right.
Perfect.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, how long have we got before you want to start?
Why don't you give me about 5 minutes? I'm going to go out into our kind of opening lobby area and encourage people to come in. We have coffee and things out there. So I'll be back here in 5 minutes, and then I'll remind everyone of the procedures for things, and then I'll give you an introduction.
Excellent.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Okay. I'll be back in just a minute.
Yeah.
I'll have the podium unmuted when you're introducing, and then
Yeah.
unmuted again, and just make sure your computer's muted.
Yeah.
Because that's what causes that loop.
Yeah.
It's picking up you on Zoom.
Okay. Let me see. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hey, everyone, let's get started. Good morning. Let's get started for today. Welcome back to our second day of the Fall 2021 Kendon Smith Lecture Series entitled Are We What We Eat? An interdisciplinary look at food, culture, and health. Today we'll be moving from the lens of the child and the family to the lens of society and policy. We'll hear first from Dr. Julian Agyeman and next from Dr. Kelly Brownell. Before I introduce Dr. Agyeman, I just want to remind everyone of the question and answer procedures. So like yesterday, I'll be moderating questions. And if you're in the room, I'd like you to come up to one of these microphones to ask your question. And one of my students will turn on the iPad so that everybody on the Zoom and out in cyberspace can hear you. If you were on Zoom, you can either raise your hand using the raise hand feature or just post your question in the chat box and I will call on you or ask your question for you. And if you're on another social media platform, feel free to post your question as a comment and I will read it out and kind of keep an eye on it. Okay, I think all of that went smoothly yesterday, so hopefully we'll have a nice, smooth technical experience today. Now on to the main event. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Julian Agyeman, Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. He's the originator of the concept of just sustainabilities, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He centers his research on critical explorations of the complex and embedded relationships between humans and the urban environment, whether that's mediated by governments or social movement organizations, and their effects on public policy and planning processes and outcomes, especially in relation to notions of justice and equity. He's the author or editor of several awesome books, including Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, and Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities, which was one of Nature's top 20 books of 2015. In 2018, he was awarded the Athena City accolade by KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julian Agyeman for his talk, Food Justice, Food Apartheid, and Urban Planning. Hold on just a second, we can't hear you in the room. There we go. Okay, now we can hear you in the room.
Well, thank you, Jasmine. Honored to be part of this interdisciplinary event, and I really want to speak to the role of urban planning in food justice and in another term that I'm sure that some of you have heard called food apartheid. Before I start, I'd like to recognize that I'm speaking to you from Wampanoag and Massachusetts territory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, their past, their present, and their future, and we commit to a principle of care and respect as part of this meeting. Problem number one, we need to acknowledge something. We cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning. Okay, it's a very heavy statement to start with, but it's actually true. There's a whole field called urban political ecology that argues we as humans are embedded in and we are embodied with processes and structures in society that either allow us to do things or stop us doing things. But I'm going to argue that urban planning in the United States, focused as it was and is to a certain extent on segregating groups of people, allow us to make this statement. We cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning. The reason why certain people cannot provision adequate, nutritious, culturally appropriate food is because of the way cities were designed. Therefore, their hunger, their lack of access to nutritious, culturally appropriate food is the result of the way we plan our cities. Point number two, this is intentional. This is not by accident, it was by design. And I wrote a paper, you can check it out, called How Urban Planning and Housing Policy Help Create Food Apartheid in US Cities. I want to go a little bit further than that. Let's think about this term food desert. Now, with my food justice class, we talk about, is it a good term? Is food desert a good term? And I can go backwards and forwards. On the one hand, it's good that we recognise there are parts of cities where food access, food provisioning is difficult. Period. It's a good thing. But do we need to further label communities? Communities that are environmental justice communities, food justice communities, food deserts. Is that labeling stigmatizing or liberating? How do you think about that? Sometimes we talk of food swamps, places with a preponderance of stores selling fast and junk food. But both of these terms miss the point, and the key point is they are depoliticized and de-racialized in many ways. They ignore the historical roots and deeply racialized nature of food access. Anthropologist and food justice scholar Ashante Reese says we should use the term food apartheid because food apartheid is intimately tied to policies and practices, current and historical, that come from a place of anti-blackness. So food apartheid would seem, given my first statement about we cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning, food apartheid would seem a more appropriate term. It does give us a link to the intention behind those policies and processes that have created zones of food apartheid. In another lecture, but I want to just mention it here, I talk about urban planning as the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, but we can do something about it. And I talk about this in relation to Minneapolis, where 150 years ago, the population of color was fairly well spread across Minneapolis. But today, it is concentrated in North Minneapolis, precisely because of racist covenants, redlining, and zoning issues. Our cities look the way they do because we intended them to look the way they do. Now, I'm not saying that urban planners are racist, but what I'm saying is they are inheriting a racist legacy. I teach in an urban planning school. To a person, students come because they want to do social good, but they have to understand the historical and structural contexts in which they're working. I want to just unpack this a little bit with reference to Oakland, California. There's a great chapter in my book, Cultivating Food Justice, by a guy called Nathan McClintock, who really looks at how did Oakland go from a garden city, an industrial garden city, to a food desert. And he says structural processes have restricted access to healthy food for residents of the flatland. A combination of industrial location, residential development, city planning, and racist mortgage lending, which have unevenly developed the city's landscape and concentrated the impacts of capital devaluation within the flatlands, and which ultimately created the city's food deserts. So you can see here the flatlands, West Oakland, largely African American, Fruitvale, Mexican American. The wealthy moved out and moved into the Oakland Hills. I want to just go a little bit further with this. McClintock describes Oakland, now West Oakland largely, as a crude mosaic of parks and pollution, privilege and poverty, whole foods and whole food deserts. Isn't that a great quote? A crude mosaic of parks and pollution, privilege and poverty, whole foods and whole food deserts. Now, what are those structural processes that he's talking about? Well, one is redlining. And here I've put the two maps together. You can see how the flatlands and Fruitvale were largely zone D, being hazardous because they contain a lot of people of colour and low-income groups. Redlining was the government and private sector way of restricting or stopping investment in certain neighbourhoods. And, you know, those of you who are interested in this, there's a Professor Vivek Shamdas at Portland State University who's mapped redline neighbourhoods, Zone D neighbourhoods, the hazardous neighbourhoods. He's mapped them and he's proven statistically that they are hotter in summer than surrounding areas. Why? Because they have less trees, they have less green space, and they have much more asphalt and tarmac, which absorbs heat. So basically, these red line neighbourhoods, their toxic legacy lives on as superheated neighbourhoods within urban areas. So you can see there that West Oakland and downtown were separated. How did that happen? Well, it happened because of I-980. I-980 is racist infrastructure. Now, you might say, well, Julian, how can a road be racist? Well, the road itself is racist, of course, but the intention and its path, its location can be. And I-980 was deliberately driven through the gap between West Oakland and downtown to separate. Separation, segregation was some of the white supremacist tools were used in urban planning. I'm going to go back to urban planning a little bit later. I want to talk about the second problem. When we think about the food movement, the alternative food movement, it's the dominant narrative we hear with Michael Pollan. We hear all of those great writers talking about food issues, how we need to change the way we are, how we need to vote with our fork. But voting with our fork assumes that you can choose what food to buy. It's an assumption, again, I'm going to come back to. But this idea of the local food movement it's a vote for environmental sustainability. It's local. It's biologically diverse polyculture. It's avoidance of the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. It's a vote for small family-owned farms as opposed to the big agribusinesses. And there's two very typical scenes: the buy fresh, buy local. We have, advice to buy fresh, buy local, and to shop at farmers markets. But this narrative, this consistent and dominant narrative, along with the movement's predominantly white and middle-class character, suggests that the food movement itself is something of a monoculture. It's advocating polycultural growth, and yet the movement is a monoculture. It consists of like-minded people with like-minded values and like-minded ideas about how we make change. And just to drive this home, look at this, buy fresh, buy local, Central Texas, Nebraska, Chesapeake. All of the fruits and foods we used to see are Euro-style colonial foods. The imaginary that came up with this buy fresh, buy local is very much an imaginary of the past. It's a past America. It's not what I see in the present, nor what America of the future will look like. It has tendencies and it does have links to nativist sentiments. Buy fresh, buy local. Things were better in the past. Mom and pop on the farm. We treated people better on the farm because it was small. That's not necessarily true. The movement is a privileged narrative. When Michael Pollan tells us not to eat anything your great-grandmother would recognize as food, he's ignoring the fact that our great-grandmothers came from a variety of social contexts and economic contexts. Some of them ate the scraps off the table, no choice, but that's what you eat. Some of them came to Ellis Island and they had their names changed, they had their identities changed, and their food ways were altered as well. So, you know, Holland, great guy, but his privileged positionality fails to consider the effect of race, income on food access, and his meanings are subtly, or not so subtly, exclusive. There are exclusivities woven into the narrative of the alternative food movement. So I would argue the alternative food movement is incomplete. It's complete in its incompleteness, in a sense. It ignores the fact that the most harmed people by food systems, people like this man in this food hall, they are the most harmed by the food system. What about a food movement that brought in these people who would like to eat good food, but it's not available or they can't afford it? So how do we create an alliance between the privileged alternative food movement and the less privileged movement, as I will go on to describe, food justice? Now, those of you who are sociologists will know the classic work of Omi and Winant on racial projects and racial formation. The food system is a racial project. Ever since the earliest days of agriculture in the United States, people have been forced into precarity, insecure, and often slave conditions to farm employers. It was African Americans, now it's largely Latinx people. The people that farm our fruits and vegetables in California, those workers, those precarious workers, can't even afford to buy the food that they grow. And the irony is that food workers, food and especially farm workers, are some of the most food insecure people in the United States. That's thinking. The people who are growing our food, who are cultivating and picking our food, are some of the most food insecure. Now, out of this moral morass and this problem has arisen a very powerful movement called the food justice movement. And it's interesting, isn't it? We have the environmental movement in the US and we have an environmental justice movement. We have the climate movement and climate justice movement. We have the food movement and we have the food justice movement. We always have to have in the US social movements, it seems, a justice-based mirror image of the other movements. I would like to see the environmental movement take a bigger responsibility for justice, the climate movement a bigger responsibility for justice. But until that happens, we will have these justice-focused movements. So food justice then is communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat food that is fresh, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate, and grown with the well-being of land, workers, and animals in mind. And essential to the food justice movement's work and change agenda is an acknowledgement that the food system itself is a racial project. And there are many groups working on food justice, from the Food Chain Workers Alliance, Food First, Restaurant Opportunities Center, the Food Project, for instance, in the Boston metro area. And these organizations are more than just looking at food and food provision. They're looking at a new socioeconomic system that can provide jobs, good jobs for local workers, meaningful jobs that have been decimated in the past. Their jobs have been decimated by the decline of the manufacturing industry. So food justice, like environmental justice, isn't just about food or the environment. It's about creating a more locally responsive, socially just food system with economic opportunities. Now, I also want to just get you to think a little bit more broadly about this idea of food, nutrition, nourishment. And the idea of food waste, I think, can help us do that. The anthropologists call food waste these manifestations and symbols of cultural histories. Food isn't simply a bunch of molecules we put into our body. Food is love, food is performance, food is comfort, food is identity. And as individuals participate in culturally defined ways, they perform their identities. They perform their memberships in particular groups, and they perform their racial identities. I want to think about what is local food. We have this obsession with local. We have this obsession with the idea that if we can just make local food the food of choice, then things will be more socially just. But there is abundant evidence from the literature that just asking for local food does not immediately lead to greater social justice. You can go to farms in upstate New York, anywhere, and you can find workers treated badly on small farms. Social justice doesn't happen through localization. And here's the problem. The obsession of the alternative food movement is not with a more socially just and equitable food system, which should be its goal, it's with localization. They've confused the ends with the means. The ends should be a more socially just and equitable food system. The means might include localization. But I want to ask you this question: what are local foods in an intercultural society? Here's a great story. George and Julia Bowling are Maryland farmers. As Maryland farmers, they've been encouraged over the last 20, 30 years to get out tobacco, and the state offers incentives to diversify. So, being good entrepreneurs, George and Julia thought, what are we going to do? What's our future? And they realized there's about 120,000 Africans in the DC metro area. Many of whom are middle or upper middle class diplomats, doctors, professors, policymakers, etc. These people want to eat locally grown African food. So the Bowlings enlisted the help of the University of Maryland Extension Service, and they tried to work out what will grow, what African foods will grow. As it happens, there's a lot of African foods that will grow. They started growing them, and now, like many farms in Maryland, the Africans are driving out from DC, picking food and taking it back into their homes in the DC metro area. So now you can see on the left the signboard for the Bowling Farm. It doesn't say the Bowling Farm, it says African produce. What are local foods in intercultural societies? Who gets to say what local is? Now, I'm a geographer. There is no such thing as local. There is no prescribed definition of what local is. It's a relational concept, and it's whatever you guys and me agree is local. Now, what the Africans clearly are doing is not seeing local as a geographic concept, they're seeing it as more of a cultural concept. Like the Filipinos in San Diego, who, when asked about their food, what they consider their food, they say, well, this is local food. It's what we eat in our restaurants, and it's what we grow in our yards in San Diego. Great concept, trans-localism, trans-local identities. The Africans in DC, the Filipinos in San Diego are exhibiting trans-localism. There's abundant evidence that immigrants bring with them their own local, especially around food. Remember, food is the umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now. It's not purely a physiological need. It is a deep psychological, memory-based, cultural, identity-bearing concept. So this idea of translocalism, I think, is really important. And for all of those kind of local addicts in the alternative food movement, I suggest we need more reflexivity. We need to let people define local for themselves. And if that means growing Filipino foods or Mexican foods or African foods, then let's do that. That's the way to build a bigger movement for a more just and sustainable food system. Let's go across the border into Canada. Nearly 20% of farmers in the greater Vancouver metro are Chinese Canadians. And here you can see a picture of a farm. Interesting from an urban planning point of view, there's a multi-generational home there. You can see that basically there was one house on the right and then another one has been built. This is causing all kinds of issues with planners, most of whom are Chinese Canadians. They are white Canadians, and they don't like seeing this kind of built that on lots. Let's look at this idea then of what the Chinese Canadians are doing. It's interesting. Anti-Chinese racism in Canada and the Chinese sort of spirit and flair for entrepreneurialism has meant that these Chinese Canadian farmers in Vancouver don't use the farmers markets that the white farmers use. They've developed their own network, a parallel localism, if you like, a parallel network of farms, farm stalls. Now, when you think about it, there's two main concepts in the alternative food movement. One is the economic concept of the farmers market or the CSA, and on the other hand, there is the concept of the local. I've already problematized the local, let me problematize the farmers market. I was in Vancouver giving this very talk 10 years ago, and afterwards an East African woman got up and said to me, Julian, I'm so glad you made that point about Chinese Canadian farmers. I shop at their farm stalls because they grow the food I want to use. Immigrant groups looking after each other, growing food, creating a local business. So when we think of farmers markets, maybe we have to think about different expressions of farmers markets. Most farmers markets that you go to will be largely white, but here in Vancouver, we are noticing Chinese farmers markets, and who knows, throughout the country, there are probably different groups who have farmers markets reflecting their own cultural proclivities. I think another aspect of food justice that we need to think about is through the lens of what the anthropologists call autotopography, inscribing one's culture and identity onto the landscape. It's almost placemaking through food, if you like. And the picture here is from the sadly now destroyed South Central Farm in LA. And these two women are Zapotec women. And you can see that they are growing not just culturally appropriate foods, but they're growing it in a way that is redolent of their own homes in Oaxaca. You can see that although there's a fence in the back, the traditional fence was the prickly pear cactus one. So they've created a space that has meaning above it having excellent and culturally appropriate food. But I always like this quote. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. I grow the same plants that I had in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. Fantastic. It really encapsulates this idea that food is the umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now. Whether you're the Africans in DC, whether you're the Filipinos in San Diego, or the Oaxacans in South Central LA. Let that sink in. It's a really important point. Food is our identity, and especially in these increasingly xenophobic times, there's a lot of evidence that immigrants are retreating into their food ways, their security around food-related events. Similarly, around the country, there are around 50 refugee farms where refugees, new immigrants from Eastern Europe, from North Africa, from all over the world come to get a first footing in US farming. This is New Roots Farm in San Diego, but just 20 miles up the road in Lowell, Massachusetts, my own university and a non-profit run New Entry Farm, again, for immigrants, for newcomers to learn about farming. But I also see these as intercultural learning opportunities. There are white immigrant farmers, there are black immigrant farmers, there are US farmers, all coming together to learn about agriculture. And I see this also as an example of what's called contact theory. The more contact you have with people who are different from you, the more likely you are to be empathetic and to treat people with dignity. So lots of opportunities, I think, here within this concept of refugee agriculture and these community farms that represent it. Little plug for my latest book. If you're interested in immigration and food and the links between immigration and food, my book, The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labour and Identity in North America, is, I think, will be an interesting read for you. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of success stories. My colleague at Tufts, Ken Lowe, and I wrote a piece on the emerging Boston local food solidarity economy. Here are some of the organizations that are concentrated in the Roxbury, Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, which is that red-lined area. In 2013, Boston allowed zoning for non-profit and for-profit urban agriculture. And really, this is stimulated this local food solidarity economy. All of these different organizations, although they are not part of a conscious effort to develop a network, they all relate to each other in some ways. And here's how. First, what the rezoning did in 2013, Article 89 rezoning in Boston, for those of you who want to check it out, what it did was it allowed urban agriculture, and we have a very active community land trust movement in Boston, and the spearhead of that is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, Dudley Land Trust, called Dudley Neighbors. So the farms that are in this neighborhood are on land trust land. They are secure. That's really important because many urban farms are on very insecure land that is just waiting for the highest and best use. And we know what highest and best use means. It means the use that is going to generate most money. So the land is there. The farms are run by the Urban Farming Institutes and city growers, the food projects. So these farms then produce a huge amount of the produce. It's processed through City Fresh, which is a sort of an aggregator. Some of it goes to the Commonwealth Kitchen and is processed there. Some of it goes to high-end Boston restaurants. There is many consumption opportunities through the Dorchester Food Co-op, Haley House Cafe, and then there is a African-American Latinx recycling, composting organization called Zero, who compost this food and then put it back into the community land trust land. So we've got a solidarity economy, we've got an emerging circular economy. I estimate that there's anything between 200 to 300 people employed there, local people, often people of color, good jobs. So this could be scaled up. One of the, I think, tragedies, though, in many ways, and I think this is an American tragedy, is, this is still embedded within the neoliberal economic system. These groups know of each other, but nobody's stepping up to say, hey, you know what, let's form a management committee, let's form an oversight group, and let's make sure that we can develop synergies between our different operations. Let's make something of this. Well, we actually suggested it in the paper, and I'd love to see it happen, but at the moment, it's not happening. COVID, etc. Perhaps it will in the future. I also have to call out the importance of leadership and vision. For those of you who don't know, we are going to have an extremely exciting event in just over a week and a half in Boston. We've got a mayoral election, and the two candidates that are left are two women of colour. The 5 candidates that were up for mayor were all candidates of colour, and 4 of them were women and 1 is a man. This is a milestone in Boston's history. The clear frontrunner at the moment is Michelle Wu, who has a food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. I've been doing this work for a long time. I have never read a mayoral statement or a city food plan, food action plan, or anything in North America that comes anywhere near what Michelle was talking about. Food justice means racial justice, demanding a clear-eyed understanding of how white supremacy has shaped our food systems. That is the place to start. I've looked at Seattle, I've looked at San Francisco, I've looked at all of these food plans. Nobody knocks it out of the park like that at the beginning. You can build from that. And I want to really, really push out this point. We don't get to social justice. We have to start our policy and planning with the intention of social justice. And this is exactly what she's done. You look at the plan, it's not just about food, it's about public health issues. She talks about workers' rights. She talks about how 70% of food system workers from the fields to the restaurants are people of color, immigrants, often undocumented. So again, it's that point about food is the focus, but the socioeconomic issues around food are as important. And I do urge you, if you really want to see where food can go in a city, this is the place to take a look. Michelle Wu's Food Justice Plan. As I say, it's highly likely that she will become mayor in 2 weeks' time. If she can implement half of what she has in this plan, it will be quite amazing. And I have to say, I'm rather proud because my food justice class helped her in writing this plan. And you can imagine for master's students in policy and planning to actually help in the design of a food justice plan, it was very, very important to them. But I want to leave you with the gold standard, if you like, Belo Horizonte in Brazil. Francis Mourato, the great food writer whose Diet for a Small Planet is actually 50 years old this year. It's frightening, it makes me feel so old because I remember reading it in college. Her plan, the Belo Horizonte plan is spectacular. Now, believe it or not, there is in the Brazilian constitution a right to food. And my food justice class and I were thinking about this. Brazil, the right to food. America, the right to bear arms. Go figure. So there is a Brazilian constitutional right to food. But in the early 90s, a Socialist Worker Party mayor came into power, and he had come from a background of food insecurity. And he thought, we're going to do something about this. So what Belo Horizonte has done is actually use urban governance and policy in the creation of an alternative food system. The city itself has created an alternative food system. It is unique in the world in doing this. It's conscious public policy making, and it reached out to both the private sector and civil society. And here's the spectacular results. Number one, the origins of this plan were in, obviously, the Brazilian right to food, the notion of social justice and food is social justice, and the right to food with dignity. That's written into the Belo Horizonte plan, the right to food with dignity. So again, like Michelle Wu, building from social justice, dignity, empathy, they built a system for the city. All food functions in the city, whether it was from schools, from different functions, were brought into one big director. The city fixes, get this, it fixes the price of certain essential foods that the private sector retailers have to sell to people on benefits act. On the bottom left, you can see what are called the people's restaurants or popular restaurants. These are not slaughterhouses, this is food with dignity. These are dignified places where for less than $1, you can get a good meal. Students, tourists, people on benefits. You can see how well used, there's about 10 of these in the city of 3.5 million people. On the right, you can see the, basically that site is direct from the country. Rural farmers around Belo Horizonte, from the hinterlands. This is a city taking responsibility for its hinterlands. It invites in rural farmers, and they're given good pictures to sell their produce, organic produce. And there's many other things here, schools, kids, preschool meals for kids, etc., etc. All of this alternative food system costs between 1% and 2% of the city's annual budget. And the results have been amazing in terms of lowering malnutrition rates over the last 20 years, in terms of kids' school performance, because as you know, a good breakfast is really important. That's where the Black Panthers started with their breakfasts in Oakland. These are really important issues. So in summary, we in the United States have inherited a set of cities who basically look like they do intentionally. There was nothing accidental about urban planning. There is nothing accidental. We as urban planners and urban planning faculty are trying to get our students to understand the need to undo and pick the past. And places like Minneapolis are doing that. Places like Portland are doing that. Places like Boston. But what we have to realize is cities have powers. Michelle Wu can make changes. Okay, we're not going to go as far as fixing prices of certain goods, although I don't think it's absolutely, I don't think it's unreasonable to do that. And I think private sector retailers would agree to do it if we could subsidize it in a way through some of our big foundations. So I think what we have here is an opportunity at this moment, certainly in Boston, to really start exploring some ways that food justice can be more than simply, you know, an idea, and we can really move it into practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that talk. I have lots of questions, so much to think about, but I want to invite folks from the audience to come up and ask questions. And then also if anyone on Zoom wants to raise a hand, and I will call on you. Okay, I see a question first on Zoom from Emily. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
For this really, really helpful and informative talk. I'm aware of a situation in Greensboro where an immigrant refugee community, you talked about refugee farms, has been living in this apartment building, and anytime new immigrants and refugees come in, they're sort of directed to this building. The building recently changed management, and the management will no longer allow them to have the refugee farm that they had been having. Have you encountered situations like this, and do you have suggestions for how? I mean, obviously something like what cities have done, where they were like Austin, where they zone land specifically for that, is a good idea. But short of that, are there other ways to?
Well, let me ask you, Emily. The land that was the refugee farm, what is that going to be used for? As the new landlord said, what is going to happen?
No, they canceled the folks who were living in the community in these apartment buildings. There was land, right, that's part of the apartment building property, and they had built their own, vegetable boxes, farming boxes on the land, and the new owner has declared that they're not allowed to do this anymore because of vermin.
Yeah, this is an old trick. And it's very short-sighted. Look, here's the deal. I think I mentioned when I talked about Boston and the community land trusts, the goal is to have these on community land trusts where the land is in trust to the community, okay? Nobody can push you off that. And that organization, the Dudley Square Neighborhood Initiative that I mentioned, is the only nonprofit in the US ever to have been given eminent domain powers by a city council. So, point number two, most urban agriculture is not secure. It exists on those vacant lots, abandoned lots, lots where the title isn't clear. So it's insecure. And this is one of the big problems. How do you get workers to invest all this cultural capital in developing a beautiful space? And you can do it really quickly, money. You can make a really nice community garden quite quickly. How do you get people to invest time and effort into something that is precarious? And it's deliberately precarious. We have a principle in urban planning called the highest and best use of land. And again, you can imagine what the highest and best use is. It's all about money. Now, what I managed to put in Michelle Wu's plan was this idea that the mayor can, in certain instances, instead of accepting the exchange value, the monetary value of land, could invoke a clause saying, I think this space has high use value. So use value is exactly what you're talking about there, Emily, with these. This is something that's really important to these immigrants, okay? So if I were the mayor, I would say, I believe the use value of this land as urban agriculture trumps its exchange value. Now, obviously, in red hot property markets, you can't have a mayor going around doing that a lot, but you could, we could, students could, put a wish list of, say, 5 community farms that are on precarious land that the mayor should keep an eye on in terms of their use value. I think if you do some research on the land, find out what this new landowner's intentions are, find out if vermin is really a problem, or it's just a smoke screen, which I suspect it is, because they're probably, there's probably, how big is the space?
I've actually not been to the space.
Right.
I work with, I run an internship class and the students are telling me about this development. So I'm not sure how big this space is, but.
Well, I think it would be a great project for people to do a bit of digging and find out, and see if you can help the community to keep this land. It sounds like it's a special space to them. And again, this idea of food is the umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now. Where is the community from? Where are the immigrants from?
A lot of the community are from various African countries. And I think that location is, primarily immigrants and refugees from Africa.
Yeah. Yes, land precarity is, one of the big problems. But again, as I say, we do have ways around it. And, some landowners are good. They say, well, look, 5 years, okay, you've got 5 years. That's better than keeping people, insecure. You've got 5 years, then they can look for somewhere else. And perhaps the city council can help them find somewhere else. But again, I think non-profits, cities should be looking at setting up community land trust land that can be used in perpetuity for community uses, whether it's maker spaces, whether it's community halls, whether it's urban agriculture, but certainly look into the idea of community land trusts and land cooperatives. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question from the audience.
Okay, so one of the things I'm wondering about is, I know Agyeman in particular, it's a really segregated city, racially segregated city. And there's a lot of stigma that comes with certain areas of the city where a lot of people in the city don't want to go to this, the quote unquote unsafe area, things like that. And what I'm wondering is, do you run into this as an issue a lot in urban planning where people are hesitant because of these stigmas? How do you fight that in terms of trying to get justice for food and other types of resources in those areas and things of that nature?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a very broad question. Yes, neighborhoods are stigmatized. And there are those red line neighborhoods, those neighborhoods that were starved of resources, where antisocial activities began because the streets were empty. There is this sort of notion of the broken window theory. Now, I know it's been illustrated in some ways, but if a neighborhood has had the money taken out of it, the resources have gone, some of the buildings are boarded up, the city doesn't clean the streets as frequently as other places, and the trash cans get knocked over and the vermin starts running. That's a neighborhood in decline, and people then are wary about going to those neighborhoods. It's not investment. Now, one of the other problems we face in urban planning is that neighborhood is ready for gentrification. Okay, gentrification and displacement is a big thing. You get one or two urban pioneers who buy a place, and then a cappuccino place opens or a juice bar. You know the kind of process, and then the bike lanes come in, and then lo and behold, there's a park in the neighborhood. That's the process of gentrification. Now, I don't know this particular neighborhood, but I'm just wondering, are there signs of gentrification in or around that neighborhood?
There are definitely some creeping outwards from like the downtown area, because it borders downtown. So going from downtown forward, going from downtown forward, there does seem to be some signs going outwards that you see that gentrification, like, cute coffee shops, things like that on more historically redlined areas. I have not been through a lot of those areas either. Myself, like I said, super segregated city. And there's been less of a reason because there's not things out there, and that's part of the issue, right? So I would imagine starting to probably, given the housing market in Greensboro, but I couldn't say for sure.
These are the things to be looking at in these neighborhoods, and this is not just in the US. I mean, in the 80s, I lived in a neighborhood in South London that had similar issues to what you were talking about. Taxis wouldn't take you to that neighborhood at night and blah, blah, blah. And now, 25 years on, last time I went back, the market is full of stores selling brioche and, super expensive cortado coffees, and, the old market store owners have been replaced by a whole new generation of hipsters. This is happening worldwide. And one geographer said, we're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in. I think this is true around the world. If you look at Vancouver, London, Montreal, Boston, and I'm sure, I don't know about Greensboro, it's quite a small place, but these cities are becoming investment hubs for faceless companies, often shell companies, for international capital. And that's driving gentrification as well. And those neighborhoods that are downhill now, are prized places because people want to, buy at the bottom of the market. And those houses are probably very cheap in that neighborhood. 10 years' time, let's revisit this and think about that neighborhood. People will be dying to get into that neighborhood.
But that's still.
Thank you.
And I guess I understand that's still not do justice. That's actually like just completely going over the problem altogether and not actually solving anything at that point, correct?
Yeah. Look, food injustice is one of the systemic bunch of problems you're going to find in these kind of neighborhoods, along with, educational underachievements, health issues, I would say probably higher than, usual drug use, etc. I mean, these neighborhoods were starved deliberately. And in many ways, perhaps gentrification is or was a goal that, that these I've got a great quote from one of my books. We interviewed a guy in West Oakland. He's an old African American man, and he's sitting outside his house, and he points and he says, someday the white folks are going to want these homes again. The white folks left, went to the hills, and now Oakland, Brooklyn, Dorchester, Roxbury, all of these redline neighborhoods, it's like gentrification on steroids. So, these are the processes of, you should come and do a master's degree in urban planning, Samantha.
Okay, any questions from the audience? I will take a peek on, just looking for questions from the audience, and I'm peeking through the Zoom to see if anyone has a raised hand. Oh, I see someone coming down from the audience to ask a question.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Julian. One thing I'm wondering, so I'm come from a very different side of research. I'm wondering, what do you think are the
I
most
can't hear anything at the moment.
Samantha, are you unmuted? I think we just do this. Okay. Let's do this.
Are we good? Okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Julian. I come from a very different side of research. I'm wondering, what sort of tools do you think are the most important for the type of work that you do? A census data or interviewing people in communities or something else?
Yeah, look, so one of the things that in urban planning we use a lot is kind of demographic data. So, we look at the demographics of neighborhoods, but that only takes you into a very superficial realm, because you then know the percentage of white, African American, Latinx, Asian, you know the percentages. But what I'm more moving into now is what is called deep ethnography. What we need to know is a deep ethnographic understanding of neighborhoods. And the beauty of that is we can co-produce those ethnographies with the communities themselves. So I was really pleased a couple of years ago we hired in our urban planning department an urban anthropologist, and she teaches a class now on ethnography for urban planning. Ethnography it drills us down beneath the demographic data into what makes this community tick. What makes Somalis tick? What makes the Syrians? We need that kind of understanding. You can imagine an urban planning department in Greensboro or here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, developing a resource bank of community ethnographies, co-produced by urban planning students. I would willingly offer my students by urban planners themselves and by the community. And in that process of co-production, planners learn more because you're working with the local community to unearth community stories, community narratives. In fact, if you're interested, go to a website, urbanfoodstories.com, and that's my attempt at unearthing some of these community stories, often immigrant generated, about food. So yes, we use case studies, we use community narratives, we use community histories, but what we're aiming at is deep ethnographic understandings of communities. So not just presence or absence data, i.e. demographic data, but what makes this community tick data. That's what we need in working with these communities. And so, another piece of work that one of my students is doing is looking at, if you look at an urban park, there's three processes. It first has to be designed, then it has to be managed, and then it has to be programmed. What if we co-designed, co-managed, and co-programmed parks with communities? Those parks would work then. Those parks would be community residents, rather than having some urban designer who comes from the suburbs and who is largely likely to be a white man designing parks on behalf of communities. Co-design, co-management, co-programming of parks. It's got to be the way forward. In all of my work, I suppose what I'm looking at is how do we go beyond locating communities to really invest in them and working with them on both understanding the community, but also looking at co-production processes. Parks are a really good example of how we can do that. Community gardens, again, urban agriculture projects, all of these kind of land use-based projects could be done in a much more co-productive way, if you like, with communities.
Thank you so much. I'm looking for more questions from the audience or on Zoom. I'm looking for any hands up. And if I don't see any, I have a question of my own to ask, which is, I found that that figure that you showed, the cycle of, what was a successful program in Boston, I found that really compelling. And I was curious if you had insights into how COVID has affected different nodes of that program, either in negative ways or if it's providing opportunities to reimagine things in a positive way?
You know, it's a great question, Jasmine, and the answer is, you know, we wrote that paper in 2018, so this was all pre-COVID. We haven't followed up at all, but I can only assume that, I mean, you know, the network is still there, but I'm assuming that COVID has at least, you know, stopped any potential growth at the moment. You know, I mean, some of the food co-ops didn't close down, but they went on to sort of very shorter working hours. I mean, the community gardens were still and are still open, the farms are open, so everything's still working, but I can just assume that it's a slightly more constrained set of processes at the moment.
Okay, I see a question from Emily. I'll give you the floor again.
Taking in everything you say as a rule book for how to go about this, or the kinds of, I know that the kind of language that you use when you're trying to make a case for this can be really important. And I wondered what you thought about, since we were talking about the best use sort of language, and is there a way to make an economic case for the kind of empowering of communities that you're talking about? I think there must be. I'm just not, you know, in the field, and I would love to hear more about it, because sometimes when you bring things to, you know, city council or something with the idea of justice and equity, their minds turn off, right? Especially if there's not a lot of people of color on the council. So
Yeah, look,
how can you make?
Great question, and then, you know, and you should be an urban planner, Emily. You're asking all the right questions. Look, let me give you an example outside of food, about valuation. So a friend of mine is environment manager at the city of Durban in South Africa, and she was having exactly the problem that you're having, all the youth that you know illustrated there. The city council didn't understand the value of ecosystem services within the greater Durban basin. It's kind of a, you know, sort of basin. So she got some consultants in to do an evaluation of ecosystem services. And when she presented them to the city council, we get X million rand, South African currency, we get X million rand of ecosystem services for free from the Durban Basin. They suddenly got it. They realized we've got to stop cutting down forests. We've got to stop draining wetlands. We've got to stop doing these things. Now, many people in the environmental movement have a real aversion to valuing nature. Not me, I'm a pragmatist. We've got a problem. We've got a really big problem, and we don't have a long time to solve that problem. We don't have the luxury of incrementalism anymore, I don't think. So, you know, so she managed to get her point through by valuation. And there are valuation methods, ways of valuing resources. I mean, people have, you know, done work on how you value a bald eagle or the grizzly bear. So there is, you know, the economists, of course, have jumped on all this stuff. They don't have all the moral questions that we might have. They just don't do it because that's what they do. So yes, we can value, but in terms of a community garden, I mean, my students and I have been thinking about this. I mean, what would the quantitative or financial aspects be? I mean, you could say we grew X £100 of this crop or that crop, but that's never going to make up for the, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that the developer would pay for the land for development purposes. So I think in use value, we have to make something, we have to be bolder, and we have to develop a new narrative. We have to reframe the argument that, well, let me give you a really tragic, in my book, a tragic example. When I was working in London in the 80s, I was talking to a journalist, and the journalist said, Julian, prove to me that that community garden can stop riots, and then you've got a story. Yeah, exactly. Now, this is the time in the 1980s in Thatcher's Britain when there were riots in Brixton in South London. 3 big riots set the place ablaze. So the journalist, being a good journalist and a decent person, but said, if you can show me that urban farm, that community garden can stop riots, then you've got a story. But that's how crass some people are in looking for a story. We can't prove that these places stop riots, but we can show how social cohesion, social capital building, community cohesion can be enhanced by these communities. We can do that. But how do you measure that up against, 1.1 million for, a half-hectare piece of land in Greensboro or something like that? So going back as well, the point I made about the geography of the economy, we're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in. I mean, that is saying, look, the exchange value is completely trumping the livable or livability value. Until that changes, until a mayor says, you know what, I'm going to have a use value discretionary clause, and that in cases where I think the neighbourhood would be better off keeping that urban garden, then that's a bold mayor. But you know what? If 1 or 2 mayors, key mayors around the country start to do that, I think other mayors should be involved. And you know what? I wouldn't put it past Michelle Wu in years to come to do that when she becomes mayor. Will, confidence, leadership, this is what we need. We don't have it. The reason we don't have that horizontal food system in any US city is the lack of will. I mean, Brazil's not a communist country. I mean, Bolsonaro is the Trump of the tropics. It's a very capitalist country, yet in that city, at that time, a mayor came along and said, we, as a city, have the power to control the food system for the good of everybody, but especially those people who are disadvantaged. And one thing I didn't say, Mayor Patras Kananas, he was 92 to 96. There's been right-wing mayors, and nobody has unpacked the system. I think this is a really important point. Progressive, good, public-supported change where the public can see benefits to kids' nutrition, to food security. It doesn't matter whether you're left or right. You don't unpick a popular policy. Mayors don't do that. Similarly, in London, I mean, where Kendon developed the congestion charging. For those of you who don't know, congestion charging is charging people to go into the centre of cities, very busy cities like Stockholm, London, Milan, soon to be New York, Singapore. And you charge extra to go into the centre of the city at the busiest time. It's called road pricing or congestion charging. Now, at the beginning, it was kind of a bit of a push. People were business were well, it's worked. We now have every cent that is raised from the road charge goes to sustainable transportation, to bike lanes, to improving bus lanes, to improving sidewalks. And guess what? Everybody loves it now. Ken Livingstone was a far left, he was the AOC of his day. Boris Johnson, the now Prime Minister of Britain, was Mayor of London after Ken Livingstone. He didn't unpick it because it's popular. So, I want to really leave you with this point that if you can implement popular policy that is seen to favour everybody, especially was disadvantaged, it's really difficult for an incoming mayor to then unpick that policy and change it. So for those of us who are progressive, those of us who are, on the progressive wing, we can make good policy, but we've got to show that it really, really benefits people, especially those who are least able.
for maybe one more question, if there's anybody else on Zoom or in the audience that wants to come down. Oh, I see a hand up from Susan. So let me unmute myself and I will.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, well, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I am an anthropologist. I'm an applied cultural anthropologist, and I run our campus garden. So part of mine is more of a comment rather than a question. We've been very fortunate to be given land on our campus where I already have been working with the Student Garden Club for 11 years. And we have 50 raised beds. And because of COVID and prior to COVID, our campus is in a food desert. And we have a relationship with a neighboring church that hosts the Spartan Pantry. And this past summer, we have raised over 500 pounds of food from about 25 of those beds to donate to the Spartan Pantry, which is a lovely thing to do. And I'm quite proud of all the efforts. My concern in all of this, though, is time and commitment. It's one thing to have support and policy in place, but without the commitment of work, the financial support to buy seed, take care of the land, pay for the water. The other thing that I, in part, teaching the students or exposing them to is time. The fastest thing we can grow is a radish. It takes 31 days. We're not going to solve food issues with just community gardens. It needs a lot more tackling them. And then the vermin that we have faced, Fred, our groundhog, squirrels, we've had possums, we've had hawks and birds. The hawks are good, they're eating the mice, but it's really a challenge. And so I applaud moving the policy agenda and the commitment, but there's so much more that goes into all of this to tackle the notion of food security. And it's really a comment for you.
Yeah, no, look, I just want to go back to something you said that, community gardens aren't going to feed the city. Absolutely. Agriculture, community gardens, I think the food part of it is, I don't want to say incidental, it's not incidental, but the main points, these are spaces of engagement where people come together across difference and learn about each other. And I, theorize, there's a plot with an Irish farmer and there's a Jamaican farmer, and the Jamaican guy says, what's that you're growing? And the Irish guy says, hey, look, take some of these home, this is what you do, cook it like this. And he comes back next day and says, wow, that's really nice. And the other guy says, well, listen, come round to my house, I'm going to cook you something. We have, in these intercultural spaces, the opportunity for engagement, the opportunity for contact theory, for understandings to develop. So that's why I talk about the use value, not simply as 500 pounds of radishes or whatever you grow, but that these, and I hate to use the word intangible because it kind of doesn't do any justice to what we're talking about, but it's the opportunity to come together in an America that is self-sorting and pulling apart. That's what I see as the key benefits of a lot of urban agriculture projects. Intercultural learning, coming together across difference, encountering the other, and learning to treat human beings with dignity. That's a big part of it. And the food is, in many ways, the icing on the cake.
I think the other part to add to all of it, though, especially in COVID times, is the mental health and connection with nature. And our students have so benefited just relaxing, reading. I've never had reading is therapeutic.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So look at the co-benefits, and Emily asked, can we value that? We might say, should we even try to value that? Because it's never going to come in at what the exchange value is. So what we have to do, I think, is reframe the narrative around, use value being something that in certain circumstances just trumps whatever the exchange value is. Now, if a affordable housing developer were wanting to develop the land, then we have a slightly different problem. But you know, no, I mean, it's happening in New York. I mean,
Our land is slated for demolition.
so yeah. I mean, you know, every case obviously is individual, but I think, you know, a principle to take away from this talk is we must not discount use value. You know, you and I just had a 5-minute conversation about all the benefits in addition to the food, the mental health benefits, the socialization, the destigmatization, the developing of understanding of the other. All of these benefits are huge, especially in our, you know, increasingly self-sorting communities.
Well, I think we're at our time for today. I just want to thank you, Dr. Agyeman, so much for your talk. I enjoyed it so much, and everyone for your questions and for a terrific discussion. Okay, we'll take a coffee break. If you could all be back at 10:30, that would be terrific. Just sending everybody in the room to a coffee break. So we'll be back at 10:30 with our next speaker.
But because they're online, like you can't talk to like, it wasn't you.
Hi, Dr. Brownell. Thank you for joining us. I just sent everyone in our audience here up to a coffee break, but we'll be ready to get started with your talk in about 15 minutes or so. And I think that I have the share. You have the share screen permission if there's anything that you want to try out. Oh, and just unmute yourself because I can hear you.
Oh, yeah, sounds good. I'll be all set again.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Oh, left. That was good. I was quick with the muting and unmuting.
It was really good, yeah.
I wrote some notes for even when we do anything this way again. I felt like when people were talking to each other on Zoom, that was easy.
Yes.
It's the Zoom to in-person
Hybrid
that was
thing.
harder. Yeah, harder than yesterday was what I wasn't expecting. But that's okay. We're trying to be quick with our mutes and unmutes.
No, I think it's working really well. Learned a lot sitting back.
Yeah. Is this the first big event that you've done?
It's one of them.
Yeah.
One of them. Because we have the Chancellor's thing.
Oh, yeah.
But, and homecoming was my first week, so. But this is like the first multi-part thing, so that's fun.
Yeah. 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 I think we'll be done. Hey Kelly, I am going to go try to round everybody up from the coffee break, get them back into the auditorium. If you wanna, I have the screen sharing permission enabled. If you wanna share any slides, you can go ahead and do that, and then I will, introduce you when I get back. Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope everyone enjoyed that coffee break. I'm thrilled to present our final speaker for this series, Dr. Kelly Brownell. Dr. Brownell is director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University, where he is also the Robert L. Flowers Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience. From 2013 to 2018, Dr. Brownell served as Dean of the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke. And in 2006, Time magazine listed Brownell among the world's 100 most influential people in its special Time 100 issue featuring those whose power, talent, or moral example is transforming the world. Brownell was elected to membership in the National Academy of Medicine in 2006 and has received numerous awards and honors for his work, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association, the Graduate Mentoring Award from Yale, the James McKean Cattell Award from the New York Academy of Sciences, the Distinguished Alumni Award from Purdue University, the Lifetime Achievement Award from Rutgers University, and the Distinguished Scientific Award for the Applications of Psychology from the American Psychological Association. Dr. Brownell has published 15 books and more than 350 scientific articles and chapters. And he has served as president of several national organizations, including the Society of Behavioral Medicine, Association for the Advancement of Behavioral Therapy, and the Division of Health Psychology of the American Psychological Association. Especially pertinent to his talk today, Dr. Brownell has advised the White House, members of Congress, governors, state attorneys general, World Health and Nutrition Organizations, and media leaders on issues of nutrition, obesity, and public policy. Please welcome me in joining Dr. Kelly Brownell for his talk, Strategic Science, Harnessing Science to Create Social and Policy Impact.
Congratulations for putting on a conference at a time when it's not very difficult. It's hard to do this under ordinary circumstances, especially now. So again, congratulations. And I'm sorry that I'm not there in person for this one. I'm happy to have the opportunity to interact visually. I have to say I feel a special kinship with UNCG because I've known a number of people there over the years. Back early in my career, Rosemary Nelson was a huge figure the time I was in grad school and then early in my career. It was really nice to be connected with her over the years. Blair Wisco, I remember as a graduate student at Yale, taking graduate courses I taught. And then finally, Stephen Hayes spent part of his career at UNCG, and Steve and I were interns together at Brownell University, psychology interns together. So anyway, it's really nice to be involved with you. So today, I'm going to be talking about something that we've referred to as strategic science. And it really is a model for trying to create impact in science, impact beyond the way we ordinarily define it. So I'll be giving some examples of this from my own area of work in food and nutrition policy. But I hope that the principles apply beyond that. And one could think about taking a basic model and applying it to work in any area, depression, child development, it really could be anything. Presumably, but you can see whether you think it applies or not. So it begins with asking, let's see if I can get this to work, there we go, is to ask the question about how good really are we at creating change, and how do we define the term impact within our own field. Now, my guess is that most of us are in this profession because we want to create social good. Otherwise, we'd be in the private sector and people make a lot more money. So if we're trying to create change, I think it's a good thing for us to stop and ask, are we really doing it? And can we do it better? And that begins thinking about creating impact from the knowledge that we create in our research. And the hope, I think, is that there are different terms for this, but we think about creating knowledge to serve society. And then we kind of hope that society actually gets served, that the knowledge is being used in some productive way, and that things are getting better for people in need. But the question is, well, what's in the middle there? Does it actually occur? Is society actually being served? And if not, why? And what can we do to make that transfer better? And so the frustration that this came out of frustration I was feeling for our own work and the other work in our field, where it seemed to me that the people were running lots of studies, but wasn't really having that much impact out there in the world, and that the scientists believed that people should pay attention to their research, but it seemed the only people really paying attention to it were other scientists. Now, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, it seemed to be true. And so the frustration was that research was reaching pretty small audiences of other scientists, that misses key audience, so I'll come back to that in a minute by talking about change agents. And that leads to poor links between scholarship and policy. And if you really stop and look at the academic enterprise from the outside, for the people doing research, and this will be a little bit overstatement, but not too far from the truth. Because if you look at it on the outside, what you would see is people doing research on a particular topic. They publish papers. A pretty small number of people from the field actually read those papers. Those people interested in that particular topic. Those people then reinforce each other by citing each other's works and inviting people to do talks. And see, it's not too hard to feel like a big shot in the self-contained world that doesn't have any external reference in terms of impact. And so we're thinking about whether something might be done to help change that. Now, part of the problem, I think, is how our field construes impact. And it's not just psychology, but science in general. And we've created ever sophisticated ways of inward-looking definitions of impact. And so, what used to just be intuition now can be turned into citation indices and H index and things like that, which is good. I mean, I never want to quarrel with better measurement of something, but you have to worry about what's being measured and does it really indicate impact in the outside world. And again, looking in from the field from the outside, if one were to say you're going to judge your impact on the world by how much a small group of other scientists cite your work, people wouldn't think that has much face validity. So the metaphor that I use to describe this process is that scientists do their work, they publish their work, and then they hope that some sort of magical process occurs and the work is used by people who can do something with it to make a difference. And it's like I think like running a relay race, where if you drop the baton, your team is disqualified from the race. research field, the question is, who's supposed to pick up that baton after we do our research? Are we handing the baton to somebody who can do something with the research and really make a difference? Do we even know who to pass it to, and do we have the skills necessary to make the pass? And the way I look at this is that we don't have those skills. We're not trained to do it. We don't know who to pass the baton to for the most part. The baton gets dropped, and we get disqualified from the race, and having impact is considered winning the race. So can anything be done about this? Now, in some ways, the field gets in its own way and tends to move very slow in a very fast-paced world. Policy decisions are made really fast in some cases without a lot of forewarning. And science is, while this is all happening very quickly, science tends to move very slow. So our field self-imposes things that aren't necessarily necessary, but create a lot of problems. So, for example, it tends to be very slow. As I mentioned, it takes a long time to get a grant. It takes a long time to do the research. It might take a while to get human subjects approval. Then, of course, it takes a long time to write something up. You go through drafts, you get feedback on the drafts. Finally, you submit it for publication. There's a long publication lag. In fact, our field finally is coming around to doing online publication things. But boy, way after that technology was available, and that's an example of the field getting in its own way. We tend to communicate it only to the other scientists and not to the outside world. It tends to be unresponsive to important real-world questions, but responsive to questions that other scientists believe are important. It tends to be only programmatic rather than strategic. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And in many fields, including mine, diet and nutrition, there are tons of conflicts of interest where people in the field are getting paid by industry and then tend to do studies that support industry positions. And of course, this really undermines external credibility for the work that goes on. And then, of course, we create, like any field does, the jargon that makes it indecipherable for other people. I mean, just think, for example, I don't know who came up with it or when the word symptomatology entered the picture. I mean, the word symptoms would do just fine, I think. But, we come up with symptomatology. You think about methodology, and the word methods work just fine. And those are just little examples of things that field have done. So it seems to me we do all these things, and we don't need to, but we do, and they get in the way of having impact in the outside world. So here's how we went about trying to address this problem. Now, when I say we really began this work when I was on the faculty at Yale University. And I give a lot of credit to the colleagues and students who work with us at the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity that I directed during my time at Yale. And I especially give a lot of credit to the graduate students who work with me because they were really taking a chance to approach research in a non-traditional way. Because of course they were in an important stage of their career development, and so it was a leap of faith for them. And so I'll feature some of their work in the studies that I'm going to talk about as I give examples. So, I think at the end of the day, we hope that our research has impact on scientists, but it has social and potentially policy impact. And I think we're pretty good at creating impact with other scientists, but not in the other areas. So what can be done? So we think about it in the following way, that research can affect a number of institutions or people, and I'll fill in these boxes in just a moment, that ultimately can lead to social change and policy change. What's going to be in those white boxes are what we speak of as change agents. So the whole process begins with thinking about who is in a position to do something about the problem we care about. Now, the people in a position to do something about the problem are almost never other scientists, but they're elected leaders, they're the heads of regulatory agencies, they're legal officials, they might be the members of the school board, they could be the press if you want public opinion to change. It really depends on the topic and the type of change you're hoping to produce. But again, fellow scientists are generally not the change agents. So who are the change agents? So I'll list some that are really important in our field, and then give you some examples of studies that talk about working specifically through particular change agents in order to create solid social policy change, and how science can be used very strategically in this model. So obviously, when we think about big change, we think about elected leaders who are passing laws. Sometimes they're the most important change agents, but not always. And even when they are, it's an interesting question about whether local, state, or federal change is really most powerful and important. And in public health, the area where I work, very often the initial victories are at local levels, and then finally percolate up to the states, and then finally beyond that, percolate up. So you don't always think about starting in Washington. Regulators are also very important, and these would be people, excuse me, who are heads of regulatory agencies. So the Food and Drug Administration, in our case, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Federal Trade Commission, and then the state equivalents of these all become really potentially important players. The courts become important, and we talk about the first two things. We talk about the three branches of government. We've got legislation, we've got the administrative branch of government under the regulatory authority, and now we get to the judicial part of the branch of government. And these can all be really important in their own ways. The press, as I mentioned, can be quite important if you believe public opinion needs to change. The public then can put pressure on the relevant actors in order to create change. There are always non-governmental organizations. There are nonprofits and advocacy groups and others that can become a powerful voice and very often have the ears of legislators. And then in our case, in the food area, industry becomes a pretty important player too. So if we ask, can research be done in the service of helping these change agents ultimately create the social and policy change? What would that process look like? And that's what we've done in our strategic science model. And by asking ourselves this fundamental question about a virtuous cycle. So here's the model. It begins, as I mentioned, with identifying change agents. And again, you can think about the field that you care about and that you're working in. And if you stop and reflect and say, okay, who can do something about this problem ultimately? How can I be a helpful resource to them? It becomes a different kind of a question than how can I impress other scientists and get as many citations as possible. And again, the change agents vary, but in the case where your area, it could be any of the ones that I mentioned before or others. And by identifying them and asking that question before you ever begin planning a piece of research, who's in a position to do something with research in order to create the ultimate change that we might hope to see? From that, you develop a communications pathway with these change agents, a two-way bridge that I'll come to in a moment, to help develop strategic questions that then can form the basis for the research. The research can then be done, and then one very important point is communicating this back to the change agents rather than just publishing things in scientific journals and then hoping for the best, hoping that the time is magically getting passed. So in general, when we in academics think about this, which we don't often, we usually think about this, that we're doing our science, this is really important work, it's state of the art, and people don't know how to pay attention to it. And when we do anything active, we can kind of passively hope it happens, criticize change agents when it doesn't. But we can also take active steps. So this might be our university does a press release for us about some study, or we create a policy group, we do something like that. But it's basically just taking our information, throwing it over the wall, and hoping somebody's on the other side and catch it. But a really important part of this is feedback, not from us to change agents, but from them to us, in ways that can help inform our research, in ways that help guide our research questions and define the path of communications once the research is done. And so that two-way flow of information, that bridge between parties is a really important part of the strategic science model. But again, we don't think about it very much. We don't consider this too much in our training, et cetera. Let's see here. Okay, so the model that I just described is contained in this pretty short paper that I wrote with a grad student who was working with me at the time, Christina Roberto, who's now on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. And we laid out the model and some examples of this. And I'd like to give you some examples now. So I'm going to use 4 of them. And each involves working through a different change agent with a different set of outcomes in mind. And I hope these provide some kind of richness to the model that's just sort of theoretical until you start thinking about it in action. And partly some of these studies help inform the model as well as the reverse. So case 1 has to do with industry and menu labeling. So you may or may not know that New York City was the first jurisdiction to consider requiring restaurants to post calorie levels on restaurant menus. The restaurant industry really didn't like this. They fought New York City in the courts, and the city finally prevailed, and the regulation went into effect. So it wasn't mom and pop restaurants that might not have been able to figure out the amount of calories in some pasta dish they were making, but it was the chain restaurants that could easily do this. After somebody has the courage to go first in a public health arena like this, you hope that lots of other players jump in and go second, third, and fourth, et cetera. So a number of cities started thinking about this after New York did. Nashville did, Miami, Philadelphia. But the first state that began thinking about it at the state level was California. And of course, it's important if the state does it, because then you capture all the cities within the state, and you don't have to just go one at a time. And with New York City and California, that would be a pretty powerful 1-2 punch as this work was beginning. So we considered this a very important policy advance. We nor others really knew what the impact would be on diet and on eating behavior. And it turns out that it has a somewhat positive effect. But it was a very important conceptual breakthrough, because it was the first time in the case of New York that the Department of Health said, we have jurisdiction and interest in the long-term consequences of food. Now, the health departments have lots of interest in jurisdiction over the short-term consequences of food. If there's a foodborne illness, there's tainted lettuce at some restaurant and a lot of people get sick, they're all over it because of food safety rules. But thinking about obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, things like that, there's always something that these health departments have cared about, and saying we have legal authority to get in and do something about this was really quite an important conceptual breakthrough, as well as whatever specific benefit might come from this legislation. So one morning, it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, I had a phone call. It was quite early from the person I was speaking to, who happened to be in California, who was working with one of the leading advocacy organizations trying to get this legislation passed in California. And he told me that the governor has said that the only way he would sign legislation is if the restaurant industry and the public health community could agree and compromise. Schwarzenegger was the governor at the time. And he said, in this sort of horse trading that we've done, one of the concessions that the restaurant industry wanted was to exempt drive-in windows from having the calorie information. And their ostensible reason for doing this, or for asking for this concession, was that the boards are only so big and they couldn't put all these extra numbers on it, as if they couldn't buy a bit bigger boards and put them on the course. So that was a very credible reason, that was the one they were using. But I also got to wondering when I was talking to this person about how many people would miss the calorie information if drive-in windows were exempted. And, it seems to me, I didn't really know, but it seemed to me a lot of people go through these drive-in windows. In fact, here's a picture of a place in California where you get lots of people lined up to go through this hamburger place. So I thought, why don't we try to figure out how many people go through these drive-in windows? So I canceled some new meetings that day, and I got a clipboard, and I drove to across the street from a McDonald's in Guilford, Connecticut. And I just sat there for a couple of hours and counted the number of people who walked into the restaurant versus drove into the restaurant. And it wasn't science, it was just me and a clipboard. And, I might have mistaken a dog at the front seat for a person, and there are all sorts of weaknesses to this method, of course. But I just wanted to get a ballpark idea. And for my numbers over a couple hours, it was about 60% of people were driving in versus walking in. And then I went back and spoke with our grad students about it. And our grad students then said they would go ahead and do a proper study, which they did, and later published. And Christina Roberto, who I mentioned before, took the lead on this. Marie Bragg, who's now the faculty at NYU, was also one of the key players. And they did thousands of observations. They did different meals of the day. They did different restaurants and different demographic locations, et cetera. And at the end of the day, the numbers turned out to be pretty close to 60%. So I got lucky that first time sitting in my car. So I then very quickly got this information right back to the advocacy group in California, who then used it to argue against granting this concession that the industry wanted. And that the argument they made was, well, what good is legislation if you, from the very beginning, are missing 60% of the intended population? And this little study, which was a strategic study, it wasn't done because other researchers or we had come up with some reason for doing it. And it was really born out of this interaction with a potential change agent, namely this advocacy organization, created a strategic question and then turned into research. This wasn't expensive, it might have cost $50 for some clipboards, took the graduate students some time, but it got done very quickly. And then in place after place, including national legislation that was being considered, this little quick study turned out to be pretty important. And so to the extent it's important, we can think about the pathways for impact here. And we think that the pathway occurred through the NGO in California that I mentioned, and other similar ones across the country that in turn affected the legislative process. So in this case, the legislators turned out to be the key change agents, but only because the NGOs were working on this, they became very important change agents as well. So that's an example of a little quick, inexpensive study, but one that had pretty important impact. And you can see how that communication of the research back to the people who could do something with it and make change from it was a very important step in this process. Okay, case 2, children's food marketing. As you all know, given you've all been children growing up, people are exposed, children especially, to a ton of food marketing. When I was young, it only came in one form. It was Saturday morning children's cartoons. But now, of course, it's all over children's television, but it's also done a ton on the internet and through social media. Our group at Yale was funded by the Robert Johnson Foundation to test how much marketing was going on and who was being targeted by it and what exactly was getting marketed. This turned into a series of reports that are still being published by the Rudd Center, which is now at the University of Connecticut, that initially was led by my colleague Jennifer Harris. And this was the first report we did that was on marketing breakfast cereals to children. So think for a moment about the nutrition quality of breakfast cereals that are marketed to children. So we wanted to put some numbers to this. So we used a nutrition index that had been developed by researchers at Oxford University that create a single score for any food on its overall nutrition quality. So the score has a number of different factors that contribute to the vital score. If you have a lot of fat in something, the score gets worse. If you have a lot of fiber, it gets better, etc. So it's an overall score. And we took the dozen cereals that were marketed at all. I mean, we thought might be marketed to kids based on their nutrition score. And here are the cereals. Now, you see a few things in there that you know, but some you may not have heard of very much. And then we look to see how much the best dozen, like the nutrition score, were marketed on television. It's something the industry does called advertising, where they create these interactive games on the internet that kids play and that are just loaded with the cereal with commercial logos and things like that, and on other youth websites like Nickelodeon. And if you take all the marketing that's done for these best dozen cereals, it comes to exactly 0. Then let's take the worst dozen cereals. So these are the ones with the worst nutrition scores. And now you start to see some more familiar names. And if you look to see how much these are marketed to children, then all of a sudden the list starts getting populated pretty heavily. Now, it's an interesting question about why the industry would market its worst products most heavily to children. And we'll come back to that question in a minute. You can pause for a minute and think of that yourself. Why would they do that? The companies all have better, healthier cereals in the portfolio. You know, they could take Tony the Tiger and put it on plain cornflakes, for example. But they don't do that. So the question is why? And does this become an interesting strategic issue to address? So we wanted to test this particular question that comes up in this context, and it has to do with that why question that I just asked. We were wondering what the industry would say in defense of its practices. We were hoping that we could get a lot of publicity for this research because we felt that changing public opinion, especially among parents, about what we were thinking of as predatory marketing practices aimed at children. What the industry, how would we try to defend itself, and could we do something to disarm that defense? Now, it turned out it wasn't terribly hard to figure out what that defense was going to be, because I had debated people from that industry in professional meetings and on TV and things, and this paper got written by the chief nutrition people at Kellogg and General Mills. Now, these are fierce competitors, not often collaborating with one another, but they came together and wrote a paper on this very issue. And here's what the paper said. Before I say that, we figured, and it turned out that the industry would make a 3-part defense. They would say, first, eating breakfast is a good thing. Okay, that turns out to be true. Second, that cereals can be a good vehicle for delivering lots of nutrients. Well, that turns out to be true as well. But the third part is that kids won't eat the cereal unless it has sugar in it. So that something sitting in the bowl isn't going to do any child any favors if you're not going to eat it. And so here's what this paper said. This is a couple of quotes. So food doesn't become nutrition until it's eaten. Again, cereal that sits in the bowl doesn't help anybody. And then the second thing, went too fast. Children like the taste of ready-to-eat cereal. Now that's a euphemism for high sugar. Ready-to-eat cereals, and are therefore more likely to eat breakfast. So here we go. Their defense was there for all the world to see. So we thought, well, these things are pretty testable hypotheses, aren't they? Maybe they're right, maybe they're not. But why don't we put this to a test to see whether we could disarm the defense if in fact these assumptions aren't correct. So my colleague Jennifer Harris took the lead in doing a study that was published in the Journal of Pediatrics, where she randomly assigned children, to one of 2 breakfasts. It was the same type cereal, but one with a lot of sugar and one without, that the children were having. So it would be Frosted Flakes versus plain cornflakes. And in addition to the cereal, and the kids could put as much cereal as they wanted in the bowl. They could add as much milk as they wanted. There was a sugar bowl there. If they wanted to add sugar, they could. And there's also fruit that they could add to the cereal. And then we just looked to see what kids ate for their breakfast. And as I said, this research was published in the journal Pediatrics. Now, what this research found was that if you give the children access to a high sugar version of the cereal, they consume way more calories than what you would like a child to have for breakfast. By getting the low sugar version of the cereal, the number of calories was just about what you'd like to see, and children voluntarily sweeten the sugar, the cereal themselves, not with the sugar, but with the fruit. And so they got the nutrition boost from the fruit. So they're sort of double benefit in this. So when we published our results, we got a lot of press attention. It was all over the world in various press outlets in India and Ireland and all over the place. And we were very happy about that. We had specifically worked with communications experts to make this happen, not just relying on the university's communications arm. And when the press would call the companies, say, the CEO of General Mills and say, why are you marketing your worst cereals to kids? The CEOs would say, well, eating breakfast is a good thing, and cereals can deliver now lots of nutrients, and kids won't eat it unless there's a lot of sugar. And then the press would say, but there's a study from Yale that says that's not true. And so it really helped disarm it, and it really made the results seem much more powerful when they were conveyed in the press. So that was another example of a not too hard to do, pretty readily done, pretty inexpensive project that had strategic importance. And not too long after we published our results and all that press attention occurred, General Mills made the announcement that they were going to be reducing the sugar in its children's cereals by about 25%. And I believe me, I can't say that our research was responsible for this, because there have been lots of people and advocacy groups and others arguing for nutrition changes and quarreling with the industry about its marketing practices. But from a public health point of view, think about a single action by a single company as big as General Mills, its biggest producer of children's cereal in general, I think. By making that reduction by 25% at one time, you get this massive public health benefit that you could almost never produce just trying to educate people to make different choices with their food, because you can never have enough money to educate enough people to accomplish that goal. So this, whether we produce it or not, this is a really important victory. But to the extent our research was part of the picture, we can think about this as the pathway through the change. The press became very important. We were hoping that public opinion would be what would change the industry behavior, and then the industry did change its behavior. So this was an example of impact being created by research. The third case that I'd like to give you as an example has to do with a high consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. As you may know, consumption of these beverages is really high, and it's not just the traditional carbonated soft drinks like Coke and Pepsi and soda and Dr. Pepper and things, but it's sweetened teas, it's energy drinks, it's sports drinks and the like. There are just lots of different examples of these out there, even waters that have sugar in them. And the consumption of these is very bad news for public health, because as you can imagine, consumption is related to risk for obesity and diabetes. It's related to a number of other negative health outcomes. But it's also the case that people have been getting a higher percentage of their total calories in beverage form compared to what people in our country used to do, because of all these appealing, very heavily marketed drinks. And it's the case that the body doesn't seem to recognize calories as well when they get delivered in beverages compared to when they get delivered in solid foods. So if you eat, if you consume 200 calories in a soft drink, for example, your body doesn't handle those 200 calories the same as if you did them in solid food. It could be pizza or donuts for that matter. Could be very heavily caloric, very highly palatable things. But the fact that they're getting delivered in beverages creates this negative process. So there are lots of good reasons to reduce consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. And a long time ago, I was paying a lot of attention to work that was going on in tobacco. And I didn't do any work in that field myself, so I was a complete outsider, an amateur with it. But I thought there was a lot to be learned behavior of the industries was very similar, and that turns out to really be quite true. So what are some of the things that got done with tobacco that were very heavily influential? Well, there are a whole bunch of them, but the thing that the health economists have worked out is the single most powerful thing for taxes on cigarettes. Now, so of course I began to wonder, could we use taxes in this context too, and tax certain categories of foods in order to reduce consumption? And that led to me writing about this going back into the early 1990s. In 1994, I wrote an op-ed piece that was in the New York Times, and boy, did I get some interesting responses to that. Rush Limbaugh attacked it a number of times, and they got some pretty creative hate mail on that idea about, Big Brother overstep, things like that. But the idea percolated around, and but I didn't really think about it too much beyond me and a few others. Until about 2008, 2009, the economy turned down. And during that time, legislators started looking for ways of generating additional revenue, because the revenue coming into places like cities and states had really taken a hit because of the downturn in the economy. So then they began thinking about taxes as a way to reduce healthcare costs potentially, but also as a way of generating revenue. So it was time to get back into action here. And so I wrote a piece with Tom Frieden that was published, making a case for a public policy case for tax insurance food and beverages. Tom Frieden at the time was the health commissioner for New York City, and prior to that, after that, became the head of the CDC. The public policy case was pretty simple. That taxes are likely to work. We proposed a tax of 1 penny tax per ounce of any beverage with added sugar. So that means the 12-ounce can would cost 12 cents more, a 64-liter bottle would cost 64. A 2-liter bottle would be 60-some cents additional with the tax. I then wrote a subsequent piece that was published that same year that made a public health and economic case for taxing beverages. And the economic case had to do with externalities and information asymmetries, which are important concepts for economists thinking about these issues. And those two papers then formed sort of an intellectual academic basis for moving ahead with these taxes. So legislators were thinking about these taxes at that point, and we thought, what kind of strategic studies could we do that might be helpful? Well, one thing legislators need to know is how high does tax need to be if you're going to get a reduction in consumption. I mean, if you did a little tiny tax, no one would notice or care, and it wouldn't make any difference. If you put too high a tax on, the public wouldn't accept them. So is there some sort of a sweet spot in there? And so an economist working with us, Agyeman, did this study on the elasticity of cost of consumption with different levels of taxes. So if you raise prices by X, what sort of change in consumption would you expect? And what happens if the tax is 2X or 3X, et cetera? And published this paper. But that was just the first part of this, because again, if all we did was publish this paper in the academic literature, we did drop at the time. So we wanted to do more. So, but I'll come back to what that more was in just a minute. But a companion piece to this had to do with estimating the amount of revenue that would be generated from a tax, from the taxes at various levels. Because some legislators weren't so interested in health benefits, they just wanted money that the tax would raise. Those tended to be people on the more conservative side of the political spectrum, and it was good to have them as partners in this process. But they wanted to focus on revenue generation. And so figuring out how much revenue would be generated would be very helpful. And so one thing that Agyeman did, the economist I mentioned before, was to create an interactive tax calculator that still resides on the Red Center website. It's updated all the time. As I mentioned, the Red Center is now at the University of Connecticut. So you can go into this website and you can put in any major city in the U.S. or a state, and put in the level of tax that you'd like to have considered, and it will generate an estimate of revenue. So let's just take North Carolina, and I pulled off these numbers this morning. So if you put in North Carolina and a tax of a penny and a half, 1.5 cents, which a number of places are using now, how much revenue will North Carolina generate in a year? And it creates a table that looks like this. It breaks it down by type of beverage. But the bottom number is really the most important thing. So $512 million would get raised in North Carolina in a single year with a tax like this. And these taxes have been used in various places. The public accepts them, and the research evaluating their impact has been quite positive. So this number helps legislators think about this kind of process. So these two bits of strategic research, the revenue generating one and the elasticity estimates, became important as legislators were considering passing the legislation. And I have some anecdotes to that effect that we can talk about if you like. In the U.S., there have been soda taxes in a number of major cities and some smaller cities as well: Oakland, San Francisco, Seattle, Philadelphia. There was one in Chicago, Cook County, that got repealed for political reasons. Maybe there's some hope for that in the future. And now there are states that are considering the taxes. Outside the U.S., they tend not to be done in cities, but entire countries have passed the taxes. And there are more than 50 countries now around the world that have these sort of food and beverage taxes. And the evaluation of these, the most extensive evaluations occurred in Mexico, but other places as well. As I said, the results are really quite positive. So again, you can think about trying to, so basically what happens, if you have a tax of about a penny and a half on these beverages, it raises the price by about 15%, somewhere in that kind of neighborhood. And that in turn leads to about a 15% reduction in consumption. So that's not, I mean, you like it to be higher, which hopefully it will be in the future if the taxes are ramped up, but it's a very good start. Now think about, would it be ever possible to produce a 15% reduction in these things through education or empowering people to behave differently? I mean, first of all, who would pay for it? And second of all, how in the world could you compete with all the marketing that the industry is doing to make these beverages attractive, athletic, and everything else they do? So this is something where the intervention costs money. Get legislators to pass a tax. I mean, there's organizing work and advocacy work and things, and there's some research to be done. So the cost isn't money. You're not paying for a major intervention. And then, the return on investment is enormous, way beyond anything else that's been done for diet nutrition or obesity, because of the input costs are so low. So going back to our model here, to the extent our research has been a player in this, we think these are the ways it's happening. That we're working through public opinion, that jurisdictions are now considering these taxes through the non-government organizations that are advocating for the taxes, and of course through legislators. So let me give you one more example that has to do with a completely different change agent. Now we're going to go to the judiciary part of government, the legal part of government, and it has to do with misleading labeling. In around 2009, the food industry launched a program called Smart Choices, and you'll see the Smart Choices checkbox on each of these two cereals. And essentially what the food industry did was it got together with itself and created what nutrition standards for their own products. And they said that anything that met the nutrition criteria they had established could be given a Smart Choices label. Well, you can see the obvious conflicts of interest here, and you can see how much credibility it has with the Smart Choices thing is showing up on products like these. And so the industry completely gamed the system. What they did was the cereal people would set up a stringent criteria for fat, but of course these cereals don't have much fat to begin with, but set a very lax criteria for sugar. And then other parts of the industry would do things just like that would favor their particular product. So it was really a pretty, what I thought was misleading from the very beginning. But products started to appear with these things on the packaging. And we figured that consumers would believe that there was some, that there was some credibility in the checkbox, that maybe it was a government program, maybe the industry had to earn this somehow by improving the nutrition and things like that. Of course, none of that was true. What was also true was that the industry had given a big grant, a lot of money to a professional organization called the American Society of Nutrition. And the American Society of Nutrition is a very highly regarded organization. They publish one of the top nutrition journals in the field called the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They have annual meetings. They do this sort of things that we're accustomed to with professional organizations, and they're good at it, and they're highly credible. But at the time, some of their leadership people had been in favor of taking money from industry, so they did this. And then they were going to be the ones who administered the program. So it sort of felt like money laundering to me that the industry didn't want to have fingerprints on this and wanted to have credibility of this external nutrition group to make it look like it was a credible enterprise when it really wasn't. So anyway, so this was happening in the background. So previous to this, again, paying attention to the tobacco experience, litigation against the tobacco companies have been a really important part of the picture. And the primary action here wasn't by individual plaintiffs lawsuits where somebody sued the industry because their a relative had died of tobacco-related diseases. But it was by the state attorneys general suing the tobacco industry on behalf of the state for the effect of smoking on the population of the state rather than on specific individuals. And that had been very, very effective. Had brought lots of unwanted attention to the tobacco industry and unwanted by them. And it had a big impact. So again, I started thinking about was there a parallel here? So prior to Smart Choices, I had just written a cold letter to the Attorney General of Connecticut. Richard Blumenthal was his name. He's now a U.S. Senator from Connecticut. And said, and he'd been a real hero in these tobacco lawsuits, and was a very consumer protection oriented Attorney General. I admired his work. And I just wrote him a letter. He didn't know me from anybody. And I said, I really like the work you did with tobacco. Is there any chance you might be interested in some of these principles applied in the food area? And I never expected to hear back, but I did. His office called and said, not only is he interested, but so come to you. So yeah, he came to my office and we had a very nice meeting and started talking about how similar the behavior was of tobacco and food companies and things. And he said, I think we've got a possibility of working together on this, but we have to find the right case. So this was maybe a year before Smart Choices. And Smart Choices comes along, and I get in touch with him, and I say, I don't know that this is the right case or not, but I wanted to tell you about Smart Choices. So he had his staff attorneys look into it. He called me back a few days later and basically said, let's go get him. And that when you're an academic, you're not used to let's go get him. It's pretty darn exciting. And it seemed like it would be a pretty interesting thing to do. And it seemed like he was potentially pretty powerful change agent, and it turned out that he was. So that's the Smart Choices logo. These are some of the products that could be awarded the Smart Choices symbol, given the self-serving nutrition standard by the company. And here's Mr. Blumenthal. So what Blumenthal did was he launched an official investigation into Smart Choices program. And part of this investigation was issuing demand letters, which are just short of a subpoena, to the companies that had been administering this program, asking for information on who paid who to do this, how the criteria were established, who was involved in it, etc. But what he also did was he issued demand letters to the people who are involved in the leadership of this society of nutrition that I mentioned. And they're people like me and you, I mean, just professionals who are, take leadership roles in these societies. And they're not used to getting letters from an attorney general. So there was a lot of angst in the professional society. What also happened then is the New York Times, because I knew a writer there, had I been interviewed previously by a writer there, got in touch, decided to write a piece about smart choices that was quite critical. And so in 2009, over a pretty short period of time, several things happened. The New York Times piece came out. The Connecticut Attorney General announced his investigation. The head of the Food and Drug Administration had a public phone call critical of smart choices. And then on October 23rd of that year, scarcely 6 weeks after this process started, the industry pulled the program. Now, this was really, felt like a tremendous victory. I still look back on it as a tremendous victory, partly because it engaged, by the way, when the Connecticut Attorney General took action on this, word got out that a number of other state AGs were interested in potentially taking action as well. So it wasn't just confined to Connecticut. This felt like a real victory, not only because it got rid of a misleading and what I thought was deceptive marketing program, but also it said that, hey, there's a whole new enforcement arm involved now in this picture. State attorneys general hadn't really been involved in the diet and nutrition area, and now they were. And it also told the food industry, we're watching. I mean, I'm not watching, but I mean, the people that can make a difference are watching. And you better not be doing this kind of thing again. So that felt like a real victory as well. So back to our little diagram here. This time we're through the legal part of government, and it was legal action taken by the state attorney general, all the press attention this got, and then of course the industry changed its behavior. So we thought that this was important. So those are 4 examples, each one working through a different set of change agents, each one doing different kinds of research. In the case of the last thing, we did a lot of research on marketing that I mentioned before that was helpful to the state attorney general. In each case, the research was different. In each case, the change agents were different, and the outcome we were hoping to produce was different. But all these were studies based on interacting with the change agents, understanding what might be important in their world, and then designing the studies accordingly. So I'll come back to the model and just review that once again. But before I do that, there's a really interesting question about should researchers be doing this? Some people feel that this feels too much like advocacy. What researchers should do is their research, and it's not up to them to make social change with it. And if they do, it means that they're taking a political position, and that biases the nature of their research. Now, I obviously don't agree with that, but you can see some stunning cases in the history of science where scientists have not taken that stance and have worked really hard to create impact from their work. I'll give you one example. The former dean of the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, Al Sommer is his name, was an ophthalmologist. And he got interested in why there were so many cases of blindness, especially in children in developing countries. And he did some pretty basic research and found that vitamin A deficiency was one of the leading causes of this. Now, he could have just done his research, published it, and that would have been the end of the game, but he didn't. He then went and did some intervention studies where they provided vitamin A supplementation to children to see whether they could prevent cases of blindness, and they did. And not only were they preventing blindness, but vast numbers of cases of diarrhea and other diseases that plague people in those sort of circumstances. And a single dose of vitamin A or some supplements given with vitamin A were having a big impact at relatively low cost. And the impact was of course, very important for children and their development, but also for things like healthcare costs. But he didn't just stop there. What he did then was started working with policymakers on ways to get entire countries to provide the vitamin A supplementation so that they would have these better health outcomes. And that involved cost-effective research. What do you get back when you invest a certain amount in supplementation? And that turned out to be very positive. So that's just one example. There are lots more researchers saying, I want to make a difference with this research. It's up to me to do it because nobody else is going to necessarily do it. And so that was the case of somebody doing the kind of strategic research that we're talking about in this model. So back to the fundamental model, which is this. Again, I hope this talk might have been interesting because of the food angle on it. But even beyond that, I hope that maybe there's some applicability to the type of work that you mentioned. And can we think about who those change agents might be? Can we set up a dialogue with them? And it's amazing how often you can get people's ear if you just ask people that you think are too famous or too high in office or whatever. It's very often the case that these people like the help they can get from researchers. In a state like North Carolina, the state legislators are always happy to be working with somebody they consider constituents. They also like to help promote institutions in the state. But also, a lot of these people, I mean, if you're a U.S. senator, you might have a staff. I mean, you do have a staff that can work on things. But if you're a state legislator in North Carolina, or you're a county commissioner, or you're a school superintendent, or you're on a school board, you don't have that kind of staff. And sometimes these people can be very grateful for the help that the researchers have. So writing a letter, calling a link, sending an email to these people and saying, I really think the work you do is important. There's research on this that I'd be happy to help you speak about, and could we have a conversation? You'll hear yes more than you might think. And then that can help develop these strategic questions. That can help inform the research. Then you have an automatic audience built in once the work is done, because you've been interacting with the change agents. And not only can you get back to the change agents you've been in dialogue with, but others, and the change agents can help with that. And we hope that this can create a virtuous cycle of solutions where you're getting impact from the research beyond what might be just impact on other scientists. So thank you very much. I wish I was there in person, and I don't know if there's an opportunity to have questions, but if there is, I'd be delighted to be part of it.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Brownell, for a really, really fascinating talk. I'm going to invite folks, we have a few minutes for questions, so I'm going to invite folks from the audience to come down to the microphone, but I think that I already saw, or maybe, I don't know if it was a clap or a hand up that I maybe saw on Zoom. But I have a question myself, so I'm gonna kick us off. I thought it was really fascinating to think about, how, especially in that first case that you presented, how you were able to share that information with the change agents that you had identified. But then at the same time, there was a research product that came out of it. And so I was curious if you could talk a little more about the kinds of products that you tend to send to change agents during this time, and how making those products lines up with the process of that academic publication that also resulted.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, it's a really, really good question, because we're as scientists, and rightfully so, we're reluctant to put the word out about things until it gets peer reviewed, because that's the ultimate barometer of whether you've done adequate science. What we did was we would feedback in the case where something really good was happening, like the media labeling example. We would feedback information to say, it's not been a study, it's just a preliminary finding. It'd be a while before we can actually get this out. But what we did was we looked into the ethics of this and found that very often work is communicated broadly around the press after it's been presented at professional meetings, and that represents some level of peer review, although it hasn't been published yet. So what we were always going to professional meetings, presenting things that way, because that could often be done way in advance of when something might get published. And then once it got presented professionally, then we felt more comfortable going more public and providing the paper that we wrote for the conference or something to the change agents to use it that way. But again, it's an area where it's very tricky because the process is so slow to get things in print compared to the way these policy things move quickly. So that was a tricky issue. That's how we navigated it.
Thank you. Next, I saw in the chat that Rosemary had a comment. Rosemary, if you want to unmute yourself.
First of all, hi Kelly. Very good to see you, and thank you so much for presenting to us today. We're very grateful for your comments. So my question is, most of us in our careers do, I'd say we like plod along. It's like one clinical client at a time, it's one research study at a time, and so life goes on day after day. And so when you were, before you became a notable figure in policy making, did you have an intention to do this? So you can give us some examples of contacting like your state legislature or the school board, but then what happens next? How do you develop a career that is beyond the individual clients and individual research studies to have an impact? Is it an intentional career? Are there like lucky things that happen along the way that are fortuitous and help your career along?
Yeah, first let me say how nice it is to see you again. And I'm really grateful that you were able to sit in on my talk. Your question is a terrific one. Boy, it's a combination of being thankful and just being lucky. And what got me thinking about this stuff in the first place was I really cut my teeth. I did my graduate work with Terry Wilson at Rutgers doing randomized trials for treating obesity. And got frustrated because we weren't producing very good results. And the field was declaring victory with statistical improvements in outcome rather than anything really clinically meaningful. And I thought that in the case of obesity that we were working with, this is a problem that needs to be prevented rather than treated. It's like ear infections. Ear infection, for example, is something you can readily treat, so you don't need to worry so much about preventing them. Let's say lung cancer is something that's very hard to treat, so you want to prevent it. And so it seemed to me obesity fell into that category. And once you think about prevention, then you're away from the traditional medical model, psychology model of, working downstream. When somebody has a problem, you want to help them get over it. But you're trying to prevent it in the first place. Then you're looking upstream and you're looking at institutions and policies and things like that that can affect a lot of people. So the movement to a more public health model was planful and based on my own frustration with what we were learning from clinical trials. And then there were a lot of lucky things. Like it was lucky that the Attorney General got active. I wasn't expecting that. And there were a lot of other lucky things along the way that I didn't really count that helped shape that kind of trajectory. But I found it really interesting to think about the world in this way. And one of the key questions that you brought up, your reply, is who has the skills to do this? I mean, we're not trained to do it. We're not reinforced for doing it. People are hired based on their ability to do it. And they're not promoted based on their ability to do this kind of thing. And that's why I was really worried when I started doing this work about my grad students. I thought, they can do this work and spend their graduate career doing these studies and then not get jobs. And so we thought the solution to this was make sure things get published in good journals. And so we tried to do good science each step along the way, publish things in good journals, and that would provide students the credibility for doing this. And so they took a leap of faith and boy, bless them for doing that. But they did, and they're in great positions. So proud of them. I had somebody who's got tenure at Michigan, and we have people at Harvard, Harvard and at Stanford and NYU and other places, and he's doing great for their careers. So, oh boy, I mean, I kind of say, whoa, that's a, you know, I was worried about that, but I'm really happy with that. But thanks for the question, it's a really good one. And what I hope, not that this kind of research sometimes normal programmatic research, because that's really important, but that it becomes a companion to it, and that both types of research are valued. And for the students who want to do this kind of thing, there's some training for it, that in promotion decisions, and hiring decisions, we embrace people that do this kind of research, because it's just one way that the field can become more impact, the field can become more confident.
Thank you, Kelly. You're a great role model for all of the people following behind us. Thank you.
Thanks for
I see we have a question here in the audience. We're just gonna take 1 second to unmute things.
Hi, Kelly. My name is Alyssa, and I actually come from a nonprofit background, working specifically with grassroots organizations in India. I co-founded an organization in very rural grassroots area. And what we actually found from the other side was that working with researchers and getting in contact with researchers, and I really appreciate what you said about it being a two-way street where you inform research, but also the organizations that you're working with have to also, you know, they're on the ground. They have to be able to inform, tell you what they need. So we actually worked very hard to find someone like Isha Ray at Berkeley who would do a research study with us on stigma and adolescent girls. And it was not easy. It was not an easy process. And I'm also very, I really appreciate your work in terms of making research open source, and so that it's not just you're working in a vacuum. And I know Juliana Schroeder at Berkeley is also doing that, which I really appreciate, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. And I also think that it is a slippery slope in terms of, you know, you don't activism and research, and that's not necessarily always our job. But my question would be, how do you access these, especially these grassroots organizations that are doing work on the ground instead of, you know, an organization like UN Women and these big INGOs that come forth, and those are the most accessible ones. But they don't necessarily have the information and the experience, and they would like to work with people like you, but how are they able to? So that's just my experience, and I really appreciate your work, and the talk was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Boy, I'm really impressed with the work that you were just discussing, and congratulations for what you've accomplished. That's pretty impressive. I totally agree that I think that the outreach to begin this dialogue process can come from both sides. And it would be great if there was some systematic, you know, I'm hoping to alert the academic community into the opportunities this might offer. But I hope is that there are people on the other side that are doing the same thing, just like you did with the people in Berkeley. That's a great example. And if there's enough activity from both sides, hopefully there's lots of opportunities to meet in the middle. In terms of my own interaction with the NGO community, the advocacy groups, you know, I've known some of the people over the years and just contacted some of them out of the blue and things like that, just done outreach. And for the most part, it's been a nice reception, and I really enjoyed that interaction. And I very much value what they do, and I hope that gets communicated with them. And then that forms more of a partnership, a collaboration than just, hey, let us tell you how great our science is and how you ought to pay attention to it.
I think I saw maybe one more hand on Zoom, and then I think that might be the last question we have time for today. Did I see one more? Did I see another hand earlier? Maybe not. Okay. Well, I just want to, Dr. Brownell, I want to thank you so much for your talk. I think everyone here, and I certainly really enjoyed hearing what you had to say, and I think you gave me a lot to think about it in terms of, you know, other connections that my own work could have. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. And congratulations again.
Okay, well, take care, and thank you so much, everyone, for this wonderful session. I'm going to end the Zoom. Thank you, everyone. And if everyone has maybe 15 minutes, if you want to stick around, if we have some time for some discussion about, in general, all the different themes that we discussed, talked about, I thought that we could have a nice opportunity to talk kind of across the different talks that we heard in the last 2 days and the different conversations that we had. If anyone has anything that they want to start with, any questions, any reflections. Yeah, Kathleen.
Hi, everybody.